On the 4th of May, 1970, a woman was found dead on a private island in the Saronic Gulf, 60 miles south of Athens, in water that was calm and blue and entirely under the dominion of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men alive. The island was called Spetsopoula. It had been barren rock when he bought it, and he had spent years and enormous sums transforming it into something that functioned as a private court, a hunting preserve, a floating stage for the theater of his own power. The woman found dead in the main house that morning was named Eugenia Livanos Niarchos. She was 44 years old. She had been married to Stavros Niarchos for 23 years. She had given him 4 children and 2 decades of the particular kind of dignified. All composed social performance that a man building an empire across the drawing rooms and dinner tables of post-war Europe required from a wife. She had watched him pursue other women with the confidence of a man who had never in his adult life encountered a consequence he could not manage. She had watched him conduct other marriages while remaining under the law of the country, whose Orthodox Church refused to recognize his Mexican civil divorce, permanently and inescapably his wife. She had hosted kings and heads of government and members of the international aristocracy in the world he had constructed around both of them, and named largely after himself. And on the morning of the 4th of May, 1970, all of that came to an end on the island he had built for himself and for the life he had decided they were going to live. The official cause of death following a formal inquiry was recorded as a barbiturate overdose. This was the conclusion of a process that began with the coroner who came to Spetsopoula that morning and found something that gave him pause. He found bruises on Eugenia's body, not the kind of incidental marks that come from ordinary domestic life and can be waved away without examination, bruises that were sufficiently concerning that he did not immediately certify the cause of death. He hesitated. The formal inquiry that followed was conducted by the relevant Greek authorities. At its conclusion, Stavros Niarchos was exonerated. The Livanos family, Eugenia's own family, her parents and siblings, and the extended network of people who had the most direct, moral, and emotional stake in the truth of what had happened to her, stood publicly and without visible reservation behind their son-in-law and provided an explanation for the physical evidence that the inquiry accepted. Niarchos had found his wife unresponsive, they said. He had attempted to physically revive her with the desperate urgency of a man who cannot accept what he is seeing. He had pressed on her body. The bruises were minor. They were explicable. They could not have contributed materially to her death. The inquiry agreed. The case was closed. The exoneration was complete. 14 months later, Stavros Niarchos married Eugenia's younger sister. 4 years after that, the younger sister was found dead in a Paris mansion. She was 45 years old. She had also died of an overdose. Niarchos was in the next room when it happened, reportedly sleeping. Reportedly entirely unaware that the woman he had married was dying on the other side of the wall. 2 sisters, both dead of apparent overdoses, both at ages 44 and 45, both while married to the same man. Both times Niarchos was present in the building and absent from the room. Both times a formal process followed, and both times it produced no criminal liability for anyone. These are the facts that have followed the name of Stavros Niarchos for more than 50 years. The facts that no philanthropic generosity and no cultural monument and no number of legal exonerations can permanently neutralize or redirect. He built one of the great private shipping empires of the 20th century. He pioneered the supertanker. He assembled an art collection of extraordinary quality. He outlived both women he was accused of failing. And he died at 86, surrounded by his wealth, legally innocent of everything, and followed everywhere by the questions that the deaths of Eugenia and Tina Livanos produced, and that the decades since have not resolved. This is the story of how a man builds the kind of world in which such questions can be asked and never finally answered. It is the story of what that world costs the people who live inside it. And it is the story of what a fortune of that scale, transmitted to the next generation without the safeguards that ordinary life provides, actually produces in the human beings who inherit it. Before we go into it, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. Saw him because this channel reaches people in every part of the world, and we find it genuinely remarkable every time we see how widely these stories travel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. We publish videos every week covering stories like this one, stories about power and ambition and the hidden costs of extraordinary wealth, stories that the official record closed and the unofficial record never quite did. Now, to understand how Stavros Niarchos became the man who owned that island and died in that hospital and left those questions permanently open, you have to go back before any of it. You have to go back to the beginning of the man himself, to a mountain village in the Greek mainland and a port city, and a boy who understood loss before he understood what he was losing. Stavros Spyros Niarchos was born on the 3rd of July, 1909, in Athens, 3 months after his parents returned from America. His father, Spyros Niarchos, and his mother, Eugenia Livanos, had been living in Buffalo, New York, where the family operated a department store. They were naturalized American citizens, people who had made the journey to the New World and built something functional and modest there, and who had then chosen to come back to the old one just before their son arrived. The boy who was born 3 months after that return was consequently the product of a very particular combination before he drew his first breath. The immigrant family's knowledge of what it takes to build something from nothing in an unfamiliar country, and the deep-rooted Greek sense of origin and identity, and the weight of what it means to come from somewhere specific and to carry that place inside you regardless of where you go. Both of these things were present in Stavros Niarchos from the beginning, and both of them shaped what he became. Both his parents came from Vamvakou, a village in the Laconian region of the Peloponnese, a remote place in the mountains of southern Greece where the sea had been a commercial reality for as long as the community had existed. The family's connection to maritime trade ran back further than anyone could easily trace. On his father's side, several generations earlier, an ancestor named Philippos Niarchos had worked as a Greek shipping agent in Malta. Having married into a noble Maltese family, whose younger generations eventually relocated to Greece to establish a merchant enterprise, the sea was not incidental to this family. It was structural. It was something passed down through the generations along with the name and the particular orientation toward water and distance, and the movement of goods across oceans that the name encoded. Niarchos in Greek means master of ships. The boy born on the 3rd of July, 1909, carried that title from his first day of life. He spent the next 86 years making it the most accurate description of a human being that the Greek language had ever produced. He grew up not in the mountain village of his parents' origins, but in Piraeus, the great commercial port that served as the operational center of Greek maritime trade, still a city organized entirely around the movement of cargo and the management of fleets and the specific ambition of men who understood that the distance between where they were and where they intended to go was measured in tonnage and nautical miles, and the willingness to take on debt that frightened other people. He learned to sail at 9 years old, which in Piraeus was the equivalent of learning to walk, a foundational skill, the beginning of the relationship with water that would define everything that followed. His father had used the Koumantaros family grain trading network to build a flour mill in Piraeus, and this gave the family a comfortable position in the middle tier of Athenian commercial and social life. Stavros attended a private school in Athens. He mixed with boys from families of standing. He absorbed, from his earliest years, the habits and expectations and social grammar of a world in which material comfort was the assumed minimum rather than the distant aspiration. He learned what it felt like to be above the line. He built into himself, before he was old enough to know he was doing it, the expectation that above the line was where he belonged and where he would remain. Then his father lost everything, and the education that mattered most in the formation of Stavros Niarchos began in earnest. Spyros Niarchos had been speculating on the Athens Stock Exchange. The speculation went wrong in the comprehensive and irreversible way that speculation goes wrong when confidence has been confused with judgment, and the floor has been removed from underneath an entire market simultaneously. The flour mill disappeared. The school fees disappeared. The membership in the comfortable middle tier of Athenian life disappeared with them. Stavros was 14 years old when he was pulled from his private school and reinserted into a reduced set of circumstances that required him to revise, fundamentally, his understanding of what his life was going to look like. The revision did not go smoothly. By the accounts of people who knew the family during those years, the enforced financial restrictions of the post-bankruptcy period sat very badly with a young man who had already developed, alongside his considerable intelligence, a significant appetite for nightlife and female company, and the material quality of life that Piraeus and Athens could provide to someone with the means to afford them. He had seen the upper tier. He had lived in it, when he had understood it as his natural environment, and it had been taken from him without his consent in a single season by forces he had no power to resist. The loss at 14 is the engine of everything, not poverty itself, which has its own formative power, but the specific loss of comfort already possessed and tasted and assumed. The boy who has always been poor does not experience the world the way the boy who was comfortable and then lost it experiences the world. The first boy may want more, the second boy wants back. The difference between those two orientations is the difference between ambition and obsession, and it produces fundamentally different kinds of people. What it produced in Stavros Niarchos was a lifelong and absolute refusal to accept any position below the one he had occupied before his father's miscalculation destroyed it, combined with a willingness to take any risk, absorb any cost, and convert any setback into advantage that this refusal required. Never again is not a goal. It is a permanent condition of existence, and it makes men capable of things that ordinary ambition cannot reach. He studied law at the University of Athens in the years following the bankruptcy, which was the respectable path available to a young man of his background and circumstances, and he completed it with the efficiency of someone who understands that the credential is a tool and the tool needs to be acquired as quickly as possible. He did not practice law for a single day after earning his degree. What he did instead was go to work for his maternal uncles in the Koumentaros family grain business, the same family network that his father had tapped to build the flour mill that was now gone. And he spent the next several years learning the mechanics of the grain trade from the inside with the specific attention of someone who is looking for something other than what is visible on the surface. He found it in the cost structure of importing wheat from Argentina. The Koumentaros operation paid substantial charter fees to other companies' ships to carry its grain across the Atlantic. The fees were recurring, significant, and entirely subject to the fluctuations of a charter market over which the family had no control. Niarchos ran the numbers forward and backward. Stu examined the fixed costs of ship ownership against the variable costs of perpetual chartering, and arrived at a conclusion that was simple enough to state in a single sentence but required considerable nerve to act on. Owning the ships was better than renting them. The margin on the grain business improved. The dependence on external parties disappeared. The family's vulnerability to charter market fluctuations became irrelevant. He brought the analysis to his uncles with the confidence of someone who has done the calculation enough times to be certain of the result. They agreed to act on it. In 1929, 3 months before the stock market collapse that would announce the beginning of the Great Depression, Stavros Niarchos arranged the purchase of 6 freighters for approximately $120,000. He was 20 years old, and he had just made the first move of the game he would spend the rest of his life playing. The timing is the first clear expression of the quality that would define his career. The Depression drove ship prices to the lowest point in a generation. A man willing to enter a market at the moment of maximum fear, when every rational actor was trying to exit, could acquire assets at prices the recovery would eventually multiply many times over. Niarchos had access to his uncle's capital, a large and apparently inexhaustible supply of personal nerve, and the specific psychological freedom of someone for whom the worst case had already happened and been survived. He was not afraid of economic collapse in the way that comfortable men were afraid of it. Comfortable men feared losing what they had. Niarchos had already lost what he had. He knew the experience from the inside, and knowing it, he knew it was survivable, and that knowledge made him capable of actions that men who had never lost anything could not bring themselves to take. He bought the ships at the bottom of the Depression. He chartered them at the recovery. By the time he was 30, he had built the shipping side of the Koumentaros operation into a substantial and profitable enterprise, and had learned enough about the industry from the inside to begin thinking about what came next. What came next was the founding of the Niarchos Group in 1939, formalized with 2 oil tankers and 5 cargo ships, 3 months before the world went to war. He was 30 years old and about to receive the most consequential business accelerant of his career in the form of a global conflict that he would handle with the same cold-blooded precision he brought to every other form of adversity. The first 2 marriages deserve brief mention and no more, because they were brief in reality and left no mark on the trajectory of what followed. Helen Sporides, daughter of Admiral Constantine Sporides, married in 1930, the marriage lasting a single year before ending without producing children or complications that appear in the public record. Melpomene Kaparis, a widow of a Greek diplomat, married in 1939. The same year the Niarchos Group was founded, divorced in 1947. Both were the marriages of a man whose primary relationship was already fixed on something that was not a person, and that something was the construction of an empire of a scale that the world had not yet seen from a single private individual. When Greece entered the war, Niarchos joined the Royal Hellenic Navy with the rank of lieutenant commander and served on the North Atlantic convoys, the most dangerous shipping lanes of the conflict, where German submarines were sinking Allied vessels with a regularity and efficiency that was genuinely terrifying to everyone who operated in those waters. He later served as honorary naval attaché to the Greek embassy in Washington from 1944 to 1948, moving between the military and diplomatic worlds with the ease of a man who understood that both of them were, still at their core, about the application of power to the achievement of specific objectives. During the war years, German attacks destroyed several of his vessels. The insurance settlement came to approximately $2 million. He used it to purchase surplus Liberty and Victory cargo ships from the United States government at war's end, along with T2 tankers that had been mass-produced during the conflict and were now available at clearance prices. Second time in a decade, he was buying distressed assets at the bottom of a collapsing market while everyone around him was either too frightened or too shell-shocked to act. What followed is the episode that, more than any other, reveals the operating method of his mind. After acquiring the surplus fleet, Niarchos leased several ships to a Panamanian company, specifically to avoid paying American taxes. The United States government identified the structure and sued. The settlement required him to pay a fine of $12 million, surrender a portion of the fleet, and commission 3 supertankers to be built at American shipyards at his own expense. Every analyst of this episode notes the same thing with the same astonishment. The settlement that appeared to be a penalty was structurally a windfall. The 3 supertankers he was required to build at American yards turned out to be worth many times more than the ships he surrendered in the settlement. Because the supertanker era was about to arrive and Niarchos was being forced by court order to build the exact assets he would have needed to commission anyway. He had converted a government enforcement action into a competitive advantage, and he had done it while appearing to lose. This was not luck. This was a quality of strategic intelligence operating at a level that genuinely sets certain people apart from the rest. In Washington as diplomatic attaché, simultaneously with all of this, Niarchos was instrumental in arranging the sale of 100 Liberty ships from the United States government to Greek ship owners as compensation for wartime losses. The transaction revived the Greek merchant marine in a single stroke and established him as a figure of consequence far beyond his own commercial interests. Aristotle Onassis, watching this from his own rapidly expanding position, later summarized his rival's quality in the sentence that became the most frequently repeated assessment of the man. No one had been so smart or so lucky to make the right moves at the right time. Both elements were accurate. But the deeper truth was that what Onassis identified as luck was mostly the application of a specific intelligence to the reading of situations that other people saw differently, combined with the nerve to act on that reading in the face of everything that conventional wisdom and ordinary caution said to the contrary. Niarchos metabolized adversity. He took the raw material of setback and disaster and converted it into competitive position. He did this consistently across decades in every arena of his professional life. Whether he applied the same operational method to the personal disasters of his marriages, how to the deaths of the women closest to him, is the question this story has been approaching since its first sentence. In 1947, Stavros Niarchos married Eugenia Livanos, the elder daughter of Stavros G. Livanos, and in that single transaction placed himself at the strategic center of the world he had been building toward for 20 years. Stavros G. Livanos was the reigning patriarch of Greek shipping, a man whose fleet represented one of the greatest concentrations of merchant tonnage anywhere in the world, whose daughters represented the most strategically valuable marital alliances available in that world, and whose approval of a suitor was the social and commercial imprimatur that no amount of individual wealth could purchase or substitute for. 2 daughters, 2 men who wanted them. Why, the dynamics of what followed would produce the most famous personal rivalry of the post-war era. Eugenia was the elder daughter, 3 years older than Tina, and the convention of the Livanos family held that she must marry first. She was reserved and charming, educated at the Heathfield School in Berkshire, and finished at Miss Hewitt's classes in New York, fluent in both English and French, possessed of the natural dignity that made every room she entered feel more properly organized. She was, by every account from people who knew her during the post-war years in London and Paris and on the various islands and yachts where the Greek shipping elite conducted its social life, exactly the wife that the role required. She was also not the daughter Niarchos had wanted. He had wanted Tina. He had seen her first and approached her father first and been told to wait. Onassis had arrived second, wanting the same younger daughter, and been told the same thing. What separated them from that point was the application of Onassis's particular form of sustained and almost theatrical persistence. He sent gifts of the kind that demonstrated both the scale of his ambition and the intelligence of his attention. He arranged time aboard his yacht in the way that a man arranges time aboard his yacht when he understands that the environment is itself an argument. He deployed 3 years of focused courtship against a 17-year-old girl and a father who was gradually being persuaded that this was the right match for his daughter, and in 1946, he won. The wedding took place in New York. Sarah, the guest list, was everything that world could assemble. Tina was 17. Onassis was 40. 1 year later, Niarchos married Eugenia. He was now Onassis's brother-in-law and his commercial rival, and the man who had wanted his wife first, all simultaneously, and the competition that would shape both their lives for the next 3 decades had been given a personal dimension that would never entirely separate itself from the professional one. They were mirrors of each other, these 2 men, each illuminating the other by contrast, and what the contrast revealed was instructive in proportion to how completely each of them refused to acknowledge it. The competition expressed itself most visibly in ships, because ships were the domain where both men were most fluent and most invested. Pro in the terms of the competition there were at least theoretically measurable. Niarchos understood before most people in his industry that the economics of oil transport rewarded scale in a way that was specific and quantifiable and worth committing to before the market confirmed what early analysis already showed. A supertanker carrying twice the oil did not cost twice as much to build or to operate. The unit margin improved with size. Beginning in 1952, he commissioned the largest supertankers yet constructed. Onassis did the same. Both men claimed simultaneously to own the largest tanker in the world, which was not so much a factual dispute as a statement about the impossibility of either of them accepting any formulation in which the other held precedence. Say in 1955 at the Vickers Armstrong shipyard in Barrow-in-Furness, the SS Stavros Niarchos was launched. 47,750 gross registered tons, named after his second son, the largest supertanker afloat. A year later, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and closed it to international shipping, and the demand for exactly the large capacity vessels that Niarchos had been building for 4 years exploded in a single season. Every barrel of Middle Eastern oil that had been moving north through the canal now had to travel south and around the Cape of Good Hope, a vastly longer voyage requiring vastly larger vessels to make the economics work. Niarchos had those vessels. He had been building them for years. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in August of 1956, being photographed against his fleet. Fortune magazine placed him among the 100 wealthiest people on earth. He founded the Hellenic shipyards at Skaramangas the same year, the first private shipbuilding investment in Greek history, which grew rapidly into the Mediterranean's largest shipyard. He became a billionaire at 47. The rivalry with Onassis extended beyond ships to encompass every arena that could hold a competition between men of their means and their temperament. Onassis had the Christina, 325 feet of motorized yacht with lapis lazuli swimming pools and whalebone bar stools, and the capacity to receive any guest in the world at a level of hospitality that ordinary wealth could not approach. Niarchos had the Creole, 190 feet of three-masted ebony sailing schooner, described in 1959 as the most elegant and expensive private yacht in the world, a vessel whose refinement was of a different and perhaps superior order to the Christina's extravagance. When the Creole's reputation was established, he commissioned the Atlantis, a motorized vessel 50 feet longer than the Christina. The comparison reset. Onassis purchased Scorpios. Niarchos purchased Spetsopoula. Onassis received Winston Churchill. Niarchos received Rudolf Nureyev. Every move was a counter, and every counter was a statement. The single most devastating blow Niarchos landed against his rival had nothing to do with yachts or islands or famous guests. In the early 1950s, Onassis came close to securing an arrangement with the government of Saudi Arabia that would have given him a practical monopoly on the freighting of Saudi oil, a deal of such extraordinary scope that it would have made him the wealthiest private individual in the world and ended the competition between the two men in Onassis's favor permanently. Niarchos traveled to London and met at Claridge's Hotel with an American intelligence operative and fixer named Robert Mayhew. Together, over what must have been a very focused series of conversations, they constructed a strategy to break the deal before it could be completed. The strategy reportedly included the placement of listening devices in rooms occupied by Onassis during the negotiation period, among other measures that the public record does not fully detail. The Saudi arrangement was brought before a Swiss court and annulled on the grounds that it represented a threat to American national security. Niarchos inherited the business that Onassis had lost. It was a comprehensive and public and deliberately humiliating victory, the kind that requires both ruthlessness and patience to engineer, and Niarchos had limitless reserves of both. There was one move in the decades-long rivalry that Niarchos could not answer and could not match with any counter-move available to him. In 1968, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the 35th President of the United States, the woman who was at that particular moment in history perhaps the most famous and most universally admired person alive anywhere in the world. The wedding consumed the world's attention for weeks. Niarchos had built larger tankers and a longer yacht and an equally magnificent island, and had destroyed his rival's most important commercial deal. None of it existed in the same category as marrying the widow of an assassinated American president before a watching world. He was simply outplayed. It was the first time in the competition between them that there was no available response. It was also the last because within 2 years, everything had changed in ways that neither of them had planned. What Stavros Niarchos' life looked like at its absolute maximum was not something that resolved into any single number, though the numbers were remarkable enough on their own terms. It was something more totalizing than measurable wealth, a complete world built from the ground up according to one man's specifications, in which every element from the layout of the island garden to the identity of the people allowed to stand in it existed precisely and only because he had decided it would. Spetsopoula had been a barren island with water shortages when he purchased it in the mid-1950s. What he made of it was an exercise in private world building without modern parallel. He converted an old tanker into a water vessel and sailed fresh water from the mainland in the early years before infrastructure was installed. He rebuilt the harbor from its foundations to accommodate the Creole and later the Atlantis. He imported rare trees and plants from across Europe and the Mediterranean and planted them in soil he had brought to the island, creating groves and gardens where there had been bare rock. He stocked the interior with game and made the island a hunting preserve of a quality that required both money and obsession to maintain. He built roads and guest accommodations and a chapel dedicated to St. Nicholas. He created a world, and then he filled it with the most powerful people alive, who came because being invited to Spetsopoula meant you were someone Stavros Niarchos considered worthy of the company he kept. His homes in Athens and London and Paris and St. Moritz contained an art collection that was, by the time of his death, one of the great private accumulations of the century. The collection began in the mid-1950s with several Renoirs and a small Van Gogh that cost $25,000. It grew with the same systematic intelligence he brought to every form of acquisition. For New Year's Eve in 1954, he paid $400,000 for an El Greco Pieta. In 1957, he purchased the entire collection of the American actor Edward G. Robinson for $3 million. Over the decades that followed, the trove expanded to include major works by Cézanne, Degas, Gauguin, Goya, Matisse, Monet, Picasso, and Renoir, along with what was believed to be the largest private holding of Van Gogh works in the world, including the self-portrait with bandaged ear that the painter made in the weeks following his self-mutilation at Arles, the painting in which Van Gogh looks directly at the viewer with an expression that contains everything that cannot be said. In 1989, Niarchos paid $47,850,000 at Sotheby's for Picasso's self-portrait known as Yo Picasso. None of these works were exhibited publicly. They hung in private rooms, in private homes, visible to no one outside the specific circle of people he chose to include. This, too, was a form of possession, the most complete form of possession, the thing that no one else could see. He ordered his suits 16 at a time. He distributed gold cigarette boxes at social gatherings with the offhand ease of someone who has long since stopped noticing the gesture as unusual. He reportedly pursued women who caught his attention by following them in his private helicopter until he could arrange an introduction. Rivalry, a detail that describes not merely wealth but the specific psychology of a man who has spent so long operating in a world where nothing is genuinely unavailable to him, that the concept of something being unavailable has ceased to be real. His stationery bore no address, only his name in bold engraved letters. His offices in New York and London and Athens and Monte Carlo ran on the labor of the people who worked for him. He held no title. When a staff member was once asked what title Mr. Niarchos held within his own organization, the answer was simply that he held none. The name was sufficient. The name had always been sufficient. His temperamental opposite in every observable respect was Aristotle Onassis, and the contrast between them was the single most instructive fact about both men. Onassis was warm, physically demonstrative. Orhas, a man who courted publicity with genuine enthusiasm because he understood that visibility was itself a form of currency, and he wanted all the currency available. Niarchos was cold, chilly in the precise word that multiple independent accounts use without apparent coordination, suspicious in the specific way of men who have spent their entire adult lives watching other people attempt to extract things from them, and have concluded that the only reliable protection against this is a permanent emotional distance maintained at all times and with all people. Onassis clapped friends on the back. Niarchos extended a businesslike hand. Onassis invited the world into his story. Niarchos made the world come to him on his island by his invitation under conditions he controlled entirely. Both gestures were accurate self-portraits. Against this world, the marriages played out, and to understand the marriages as they actually were, rather than as they appeared on the social pages, you have to understand that for a man of Niarchos's construction, personal relationships and strategic architecture were never fully separate categories. Everything was also a move. Everyone was also a position. This was not cruelty exactly. It was a way of organizing the world that had calcified over decades of operating in an environment where every relationship had a leveraged dimension, and the people who forgot that tended to suffer for having forgotten it. He married 5 women in his lifetime, and the first 2 require only enough space to confirm that they happened and that they left no lasting mark. Helen Sporides, daughter of Admiral Constantine Sporides, married in 1930, on the marriage lasting 1 year. Melpomene Kaparis, widow of a Greek diplomat, married in 1939, divorced in 1947. Neither woman altered the course of what was coming. Both marriages were the romantic life of a man whose deeper energies were concentrated entirely elsewhere. The third marriage, to Eugenia Livanos in 1947, was the central personal relationship of his adult life and the marriage that produced the children who would inherit his empire and the tragedies that would define the family's legacy. Eugenia was reserved, charming, socially brilliant, and prepared by her upbringing for exactly the role the marriage required. She gave him 4 children: Philip in 1954, Spyros in 1955, Maria in 1959, and Constantine in 1962. She managed his social world and his European households with an elegance and efficiency that enhanced his standing in every room she accompanied him into. During the marriage, he had a documented affair with Pamela Churchill, later Pamela Harriman, one of the most politically and socially connected women in the Anglo-American world. This was, in the circles they inhabited, transgressive, but not disqualifying. The rules that applied to people at that altitude of wealth and that era of social convention were different from the rules that applied everywhere else, and Niarchos operated according to those rules with complete consistency and complete indifference to how that looked to anyone watching from outside. In 1965, he obtained a civil divorce from Eugenia in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Still on the same day, he was preparing to marry Charlotte Ford. The Greek Orthodox Church did not recognize civil marriages or divorces performed in Mexico. Under Greek law, Eugenia remained his wife from the day they married until the day she died. This legal technicality was known to everyone involved and was not accidental. Charlotte Ford was 24 years old in the summer of 1964, granddaughter of the founder of Ford Motor Company, when the Creole anchored near her family's yacht off Villefranche-sur-Mer on the French Riviera. Niarchos was 56. The gap between them was 32 years, which registered in the world they occupied as notable but not prohibitive. He was charming in the manner of men who have never needed to work at it. She was from a world in which the scale of inherited wealth was the context of all experience, rather than its aspiration. By the autumn following that summer on adjacent yachts, she had told her parents she intended to marry him. One member of the Ford family later noted that the concern was not whether the marriage would happen, but about handling it with what they described as finesse. On a Thursday in December of 1965, Charlotte flew from New York to Ciudad Juarez on a Ford Company aircraft. Niarchos flew from Canada on a separate plane. In a suite at a newly built motel, a judge arrived and performed the ceremony. The couple flew to Nassau the following day and then boarded a chartered Boeing 707, the charter costing approximately $40,000, which carried them to Zurich. From Zurich, Niarchos' private Learjet completed the journey to St. Moritz. When they arrived in St. Moritz, Eugenia and their 4 children were staying in his chalet. The newlyweds checked into a hotel. Charlotte was already several months pregnant. Their daughter Elena was born in June of 1966. Charlotte settled in Manhattan with Elena. The marriage lasted less than 2 years before it ceased to function in the manner of arrangements that were never quite real. When Niarchos died in 1996, his will did not mention Elena. She was his biological daughter. She was not his heir. She sued in both Swiss and Greek courts for her estimated 1/10 share of the estate, calculated at approximately £700 million. The Greek courts ruled against her on the grounds that the marriage to her mother had been annulled, making the will entirely valid and her standing to contest it entirely non-existent. The ruling arrived at the outcome that the careful architecture of his legal arrangements had been pointing toward for 30 years. By the spring of 1970, Eugenia Livanos was on Spetsopoula, still Niarchos' wife under the law that had always governed their union regardless of what the Mexican civil court had recorded. Whatever the 23 years of their marriage had cost them both in the privacy of the rooms where no journalist or biographer was present, it remained intact on the surface, which had always been the register that mattered most in the world they occupied. And then, on the 4th of May, 1970, the surface gave way permanently. She was found dead in the main house on the island that morning, 44 years old. The official cause of death, following the inquiry that her family's solidarity and the legal process concluded, was a barbiturate overdose. The coroner observed bruises and hesitated. The inquiry was conducted. Niarchos was exonerated. The Livanos family stood behind him, with the explanation that made the physical evidence cohere. He had tried to revive her physically when he found her unresponsive, and the bruises were the marks of that attempt. The inquiry accepted this. The case was officially closed. Some accounts describe Onassis traveling to the island in the days following Eugenia's death. One version of this visit would be assembled from testimony gathered by people close to the Onassis family over the years that followed, describes Niarchos as heavily intoxicated and as having told Onassis that he did not remember exactly what had happened that night. Onassis reportedly stood at the door of the cabin where Niarchos was sleeping and said to himself or to the air that he hoped Niarchos would tell him the truth in the next world. The two yachts passed each other in the water a day later. The two men never met again after that. People close to Niarchos dismissed this account entirely, arguing it had been constructed over years from unreliable sources by people with strong reasons to see him in the worst possible light. What remains undisputed is the sequence. Eugenia was found dead. The coroner found bruises. He hesitated. The inquiry exonerated Niarchos. The Livanos family gave him their public support. And 14 months later, Stavros Niarchos married Tina Livanos at a ceremony attended by the blessing of the family that had buried Eugenia 14 months before. Eugenia Livanos Niarchos was buried in the Bois de Vaux cemetery in Lausanne, Switzerland. Her family had decided collectively to believe him. For Niarchos, the marriage to Tina in October of 1971 was the fulfillment of something he had wanted since the 1940s, since the afternoon when Stavros Livanos had told him to be patient and marry the older sister first. The world's reaction to the marriage ranged from incomprehension to barely concealed accusation. The Livanos family's public blessing functioned as a statement that closed the question officially. For Onassis and his daughter Christina, the marriage was a betrayal of a depth and a clarity that neither of them ever forgave or forgot. For Tina herself, the situation contained layers that no public statement could fully capture. She had spoken privately to friends about her own doubts regarding her sister's death. She was entering the marriage with unresolved questions about the man she was marrying. She was also carrying with her a letter Eugenia had written before she died, in which Eugenia told her that if anything happened to her, Tina should marry Niarchos and look after the children. Multiple people who were close to Tina in the years that followed acknowledged this letter's existence. Whether it was the reason for the marriage or a framework constructed around a decision made on other grounds is something the record does not settle. What the record shows is that the marriage Tina entered was one she was already carrying enormous weight into. The weight increased catastrophically in January of 1973 when her son Alexander Onassis was killed in a plane crash in Athens at the age of 24. Everyone who knew Tina and Aristotle Onassis separately in the period following Alexander's death describes both of them as people who had been fundamentally changed by the loss into something less than what they had been before it. People moving through the actions of daily life without genuine conviction that those actions were leading anywhere worth going. In the early days of October 1974, Tina and Niarchos were in Paris. Her friend Anne-Marie de Stanville met her for lunch and described afterward what she saw. Tina arrived and opened her bag and produced pills, red and green and yellow and blue, and said her nerves had been terrible since Alexander's death and that she was deeply unhappy with her life. She also expressed distress about noticing Niarchos being too familiar with another woman on a recent voyage on the Atlantis. De Stanville reassured her about the second concern and persuaded her to flush the pills down the toilet. When they parted, Tina seemed lighter than she had arrived. In the days following that lunch, Tina presented every outward indication of a woman who had decided to continue living her life. She visited an atelier and bought 17 dresses. She had her hair done with evident care. Her face was beautifully made up. At a luncheon with a small group of women several days before her death, she seemed to everyone present to be recovered, present, engaged with the world around her. She talked about the dresses she had bought. She seemed, to all appearances, like a woman who had stepped back from an edge she had been approaching. On the 10th of October, 1974, Tina Livanos Niarchos was found dead in the Paris mansion she shared with her husband. She was 45 years old. Niarchos was in the next room, reportedly sleeping, reportedly unaware. The pathologist's official ruling was acute edema of the lung, attributed to a dependency on barbiturates. Christina Onassis immediately sued Niarchos for her mother's estate, estimated at $250 million. Two sisters, dead at 44 and 45, both from overdoses, both while married to the same man. Both times, Niarchos was present in the building and absent from the room. No criminal charges, no conviction, no official finding of wrongdoing. The parallel was so exact and so complete that even people who wanted to believe in his innocence found it very difficult to say so without qualification, because the parallel demanded acknowledgement even from people who drew no conclusions from it. He offered nothing publicly in response. He maintained across both deaths the absolute silence of a man who had decided that the space between what happened and what could be proven was his to inhabit without explanation or apology. He sailed on. He continued. He outlived both of them by decades. The final years of Stavros Niarchos' life were the years of a man who had moved past the great competitions and the great losses alike and had redirected his remaining energy toward the forms of acquisition and achievement that do not require a rival. The shipping slump of 1972 had found him already mostly out of the business, having diversified into oil refining and aluminum production in the years before the market contracted. He sold off most of his tanker fleet before the slump hit. His heirs would complete the disposal of the remaining vessels in 2003. He raced and bred thoroughbred horses in France and Kentucky, with the trainer François Boutin winning the French owner rankings twice and the breeders' list 3 times, and producing in 1984 at his Kentucky farm the horse Miesque, Ike, who became the finest of her era. He paid $47,850,000 for Yo Picasso at Sotheby's in 1989. The Atlantis II, 377 feet long, eventually left his possession as a gift to King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. He was linked to Princess Ferial of Jordan and Princess Maria Gabriella of Savoy in his later years, conducting both relationships with the same privacy that he applied to everything that mattered. He did not remarry after Tina's death. He suffered a stroke in 1996 and died in a Zurich hospital on the 15th of April. He was 86 years old. He is buried in the Bois de Vaux Cemetery in Lausanne, in the family tomb. In the same cemetery, in adjacent plots, are Eugenia and Tina. When Stavros Niarchos died on the 15th of April, in 1996, his fortune was estimated at $12 billion. He left 20% to establish the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. The remainder went to Philip, Spyros, Maria, and Constantine, with shares to a nephew and a great-nephew. Elena Ford was excluded entirely. Her legal challenge for her estimated 1/10 share of £700 million was denied by the Greek courts on the grounds that the marriage to her mother had been annulled, making the will fully valid and her standing to contest it non-existent. Philip, the eldest son, inherited the art collection and built it into one now valued at approximately $2.2 billion. He serves on the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and on the International Council of the Tate Gallery in London. He became something in his own right, adjacent to his father's obsessions but distinct from them in ways that reflect a different kind of relationship to the materials he was given. Spyros Niarchos married Daphne Guinness in 1987 and divorced in 1999. He was best man at the wedding of Prince Ernst August of Hanover to Princess Caroline of Monaco, a detail that confirms the family's position in the highest register of European social life had proven as durable across generations as its financial one. Maria Niarchos took charge of the horse racing and breeding operations her father had built. Under her management, the stable produced Bago, winner of the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe in 2004, and Divine Proportions, who won 9 of 10 races before injury ended her career. And then there was Constantine, the youngest, the one who concentrated everything the Niarchos inheritance could produce in a person raised at its center into a single life that was spectacular and catastrophic, and finally irreducible to any single explanation. Constantine Niarchos was born in 1962, the last of Eugenia's 4 children, and he carried from the earliest years of his life the specific quality of someone for whom the available world was never quite sufficient. He was expelled from Harrow for drug possession. He was enrolled at Gordonstown, the Scottish school attended simultaneously by Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, and was expelled from there as well when cannabis was discovered hidden inside a hollowed-out chair leg in his room. A royal detective had found it. The expulsion had the notoriety appropriate to the combination of institutions involved. So by 1986, he was at the Betty Ford Clinic in California. His first marriage, to Princess Alessandra Borghese in 1987, lasted 1 year before ending in divorce. He checked into the Betty Ford Clinic again in 1997. He married a second time to a Brazilian artist named Silvia Martins, and they maintained a relationship that accommodated the independent lives both of them continued to conduct. He had inherited an estimated $1 billion from his father's estate. He had also found, in the final years of his life, a form of challenge that money could not replicate, and that pushed him toward the outer boundary of what a human body can endure. He took up mountaineering with increasing ambition, pursuing harder and more technically demanding objectives in the way that people pursue harder objectives when they have found in extremity something that ordinary life cannot provide. On the 13th of May, 1999, Constantine Niarchos stood at the summit of Mount Everest. He was 37 years old. He was the first Greek citizen to achieve this summit. The photographs from that altitude show a man who looks genuinely and simply happy in a way that the broader context of his life does not suggest was a frequent or lasting state for him. 17 days later, on the 31st of May, 1999, he was found on the bathroom floor of his Mayfair flat in London. He was taken to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington and pronounced dead just before 8 in the morning. At the Westminster Coroner's Court, he said the evidence presented had a quality of excess that resisted ordinary description. Constantine had consumed 25 times the normal level of cocaine found in deaths attributable to that substance. Medical experts testified this quantity had been exceeded in the historical record only by a person who had been carrying cocaine inside their own body as a smuggling method. He had found the cocaine wet and unusable, had attempted to dry it in a microwave, and had then eaten it directly, in substantial quantities. His former lover, who had been with him that night, and who gave the court a detailed account of what she had witnessed, described the progression from the moment she arrived, shaking and tense through the hours in which he consumed what he consumed, to the moment she found him on the bathroom floor. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by non-dependent abuse. Constantine Niarchos was 37 years old. He had $1 billion. He had stood on the summit of Everest 17 days before he died in his kitchen. There is no framework that contains both those facts without strain. Addiction accounts for part of it. The specific psychology of inherited wealth, the way it removes obstacles between a person and their worst impulses, while providing no substitute for what obstacles were protecting them from, accounts for another part. The observation that the summit of the world's highest mountain does not resolve whatever interior insufficiency drove the climb in the first place, and that after the summit there is a return to the same self unchanged, accounts for something further. But none of it collapses into a single, clean account. And perhaps that is the most accurate thing that can be said about the entire Niarchos family across all 3 generations. The accounts never quite close. The questions never quite resolve. The silence that the family maintained around everything that mattered most persists, even now, even with the patriarch and his 2 wives and his youngest son, all decades in the ground. Spetsopoula still exists. The Niarchos family still owns it. The natural harbor that Niarchos rebuilt from the foundation is still there, and the chapel of St. Nicholas, and the pine trees, and the olive groves he imported and planted on an island that was bare rock when he first stood on it. The house where Eugenia Livanos Niarchos was found dead on the 4th of May, 1970, is still there. The island remains private, maintained, inaccessible to anyone not invited by the family. Quiet in the particular way that expensive privacy is always quiet, which is to say, the quiet is itself a deliberate arrangement, a continuation of the same governance that Niarchos applied to everything he possessed. The Bois de Vaux Cemetery in Lausanne is still operating. The family tomb is there. Eugenia and Tina are buried in adjacent plots nearby. He is in the family tomb. They are near him. Close enough that the geography carries meaning, far enough that interpretation is still required. The arrangement of their graves is, like every arrangement of anything connected to Stavros Niarchos, organized according to a principle that was his to determine. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation is still operating, making grants to organizations in more than 130 countries across the domains of arts and culture, education, health, and social welfare. Since its establishment following his death in 1996, the foundation has committed more than 2 billion euros across more than 4,000 projects worldwide. Its largest single commitment, the The Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center in Athens was designed by Renzo Piano, completed in 2016 and donated in its entirety to the Greek state in February of 2017. The total cost of the project and the foundation's ongoing support has amounted to approximately $861 million. The center contains the National Library of Greece, the Greek National Opera, here in a 210-acre park that is one of the largest public green spaces in the city. As of 2024, it has received more than 27 million visitors. It is the largest single private cultural donation in the history of Greece, and it is, by any honest accounting, a genuinely extraordinary contribution to the public life of the country and the city that produced the man who made it possible, and that will carry his name in the form of a public institution long after everything else connected to him has faded. There is a version of the Stavros Niarchos story in which he was a brilliant and cold and frequently cruel man who had the genuine misfortune to lose two wives to the same kind of dependency. Sad in a social world where barbiturates and sedatives and pills of various pharmaceutical identities were the ordinary currency of women living under the specific pressure of that much wealth and that much expectation and that little genuine agency over the direction of their own experience. Women for whom the pills were the management strategy for a life that was, in ways that the social columns never recorded, simply very hard to live. In this version, both sisters drank from a cup that their world pressed into the hands of all women of their kind, and drank too deeply in rooms they were sharing with a man who was present and unharmed and exonerated both times, and who went on living for decades after both of them. In this version, Niarchos is cold and unfaithful and capable of the cruelties that men at his altitude of power have always been permitted to practice. But he is not a murderer. He is simply a man who built a world that the women he brought into it could not survive, and who was never required by any authority or any person to examine what that cost them. There is another version in which something darker happened. In both cases, and the machinery of money and family solidarity and legal process and the general deference that the world in that era extended to men of his standing and his resources handled it so completely and so permanently that the question became functionally unanswerable. In a world built as his was built, powers with absolute control over information and access and who was in the building and who was in the room and what was documented and what was allowed to remain unasked, functionally unanswerable is the same thing as resolved in his favor. It always was. Both versions contain truth. Neither contains the whole of it. Both are incomplete, and both will remain incomplete because the resolution is buried in the same Swiss cemetery as the only people who actually knew it, under the dignified silence of a country that has always understood privacy as a form of respect and has never seen any reason to distinguish between the two. What the life of Stavros Niarchos demonstrates finally, sorry, is what becomes available to a man who builds a world with sufficient totality and sufficient resources that no external check on any of his actions can survive within it. Not on the business decisions that made him a billionaire, not on the marriages that consolidated his position within the most powerful families of his industry, not on what occurred in the private hours between what was done and what was documented, in the rooms where the only other person present was beyond giving any account of events, in the silence that money can purchase and that power can maintain, and that time will eventually make permanent. He is buried in Lausanne. The two women he married and outlived are buried nearby in the same ground, in the same city, under the same kind of marble, in the same kind of silence. Like the names on the gravestones say what was chosen. The questions they leave unanswered were left unanswered deliberately by a man who spent 8 decades ensuring that the space between what happened and what could be proven was his alone to occupy, and that no one else would ever be able to enter it without his permission. The ships are gone. The questions are not. They sail on without him, in every direction, looking for a port that does not exist. If this story was worth your time today, please like and subscribe so you never miss another one.